afternoon, everybody. For those of you who met me this morning, this might be a bit repetitive, but I know we have some new attendees this afternoon, so I'm really glad to introduce myself a bit and give you a bit of background. We're here this afternoon to discuss a few recovery documents that are in various stages, some really early in their phases, some a bit later, that the Canadian Wildlife Service in the Pacific region has been working on or is moving to work on. And I want to share information and sort of start the conversation. Could I get the next slide, please? I just want to say thank you and that I'm grateful to get to have the pleasure of speaking with you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Kwantlen, Kinnicottie, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam peoples. I live on the banks of the Fraser, and it's a wonderful place to be. So obviously, a lot of links to a lot of groups. So, next slide, please. There I am. I just wanted to let you know a bit about myself and my background, because where we come from always impacts how we see things. And I want to let everybody know that I come from a non-Indigenous family, a white settler, as well as a minority immigrant family. And I'm a Canadian citizen. I was born in Victoria. I grew up on the Fraser River Delta in the Gulf Islands, North and South ones, in the Inside Passage, as well as a stint living in Headley in the South Okanagan. I've studied and worked in BC Indigenous cultural studies, as well as getting the opportunity to do some archaeology in the province and in Ontario, but that's not as interesting. As well, I did live in Quebec and Ontario for 5 years, and then missed it so much here that I came running back before I'd even finished my master's degree. So I have been working for Environment and Climate Change Canada, Canadian Wildlife Service since 2013, and I'm based out of the Delta office, which is at the mouth of the Fraser on Westham Island. Next slide, please. So just a bit about my goals and outline. I'm here to just sort of provide a bit of general overview information on the species at risk recovery documents that we're working on for American badger, bank swallow, marbled murrelet, western screech owl, and Oregon forest snail, as I really appreciate that little poll at the beginning because it gives me a good idea. Seems like a fair bit of interest in bank swallow and forest snail are at the front end. And I think it's really important, again, around increasing Indigenous representation in federal recovery planning for these species at risk, like I was talking about earlier with grizzly bear, and to collaborate and develop some more meaningful ways to promote the Indigenous voices and languages. So again, if you were here this morning, you heard me speak about the language project. I'm really excited because we actually have started even gathering words from the public realm that are for some of these species, and we're already learning a lot just from that process. I also want to mention that I'm giving some high-level information, but I really want folks to feel free to reach out to us to keep discussions around some of these species and how we can work best together on them. So next slide, please. I just want to reiterate a little bit of what Danielle Privot went over this morning around a recovery strategy and what it is. It's a federal document that we have to make under the Species at Risk Act legislation. The main contents that every single one has is background information on the species and its threats, the population and distribution objectives, which you'll hear people maybe call PDOs, because that's a mouthful, and those are the goals for what biologists consider recovery of that species. Versus where they're at now. So they will include broad strategies for recovery and identify critical habitat. That identification of critical habitat is really important. That's really the habitat that's necessary for the survival and recovery of the species at risk. And linked with that are activities that are likely to destroy the critical habitat. So around critical habitat, a couple things that are very important to recall are an area on the map that might be identified as critical habitat is an area on the map, but it also needs to be combined with information from the recovery document, because there's a sets of biophysical attributes, so environmental variabilities, for that critical habitat to actually be there. So even if there's a parking lot in the middle of a polygon that may be identified to contain critical habitat for a species, likelihood is that that parking lot is not critical habitat. So, but understanding the activities that are likely to destroy is really important in the way that we can work to better a species and provide the habitat and increase the habitat that they need. The functions of a recovery strategy, as I said, it's required under the Species at Risk Act for recovery strategies, which are for extirpated, endangered, or threatened species, where recovery of that species in Canada is deemed to be feasible. So some extirpated species, there may not be a recovery strategy for, because I can't even think of an example off the top of my head. It's not a common scenario, but I'll make up a green puffball that survived in only one tiny pool in the very south point of Point Pelee, and that tiny pool doesn't exist anymore due to a storm. It's probably not worth it. And there's a giant population of them just on the other side in the United States. That's a document that may not come to exist because prioritizing things like that are really important. So I can jump into some of the species. I'm starting with American badger, which is an endangered species. This is the Jeffersonii subspecies, which is only found in BC, in sort of the dry interior, south central and southeastern BC. They can be 3/4 of a meter in size, approximately. They are, if you've ever seen one, they're pretty amazing. They have a heavy body, short legs. They look like they're built for digging. They're powerful. And they have a really distinct face patches that you can see in both those photos. They have badges on their face, hence badger. They live in really open areas, open forest, grasslands, pastures. They'll move into areas that have been cleared or burned due to fire, obviously. Fire tends to be the thing that burns, I know. Threats to the species are going to be things, there are common themes, again, that you'll hear about whenever we discuss species at risk. We tend to hear about habitat loss or damage because of development, perhaps management practices in this case. Vehicles are a big concern for the American badger. You know, if there's thoroughfares and new roadways, they're not necessarily the fastest, and trapping and persecution by humans are definitely a threat to the species, as well as loss of prey and their food sources. Next slide. There's that nice picture. I like that. So the update is that there is critical habitat now that's been partially identified and described for the American badger. So partial identification definitely means that moving forward, we're going to need more work on identification of it more thoroughly and to the extent possible. And that critical habitat that is for the American badger includes safe movement critical habitat, so passage between the areas that are more essential, really. So it's thoroughfares to get to areas where they do den, forage, mate, and do other essential activities, which is the areas called core critical habitat. Those also need to have a couple biophysical attributes within those areas, and they're about soil. I believe the word is friability, fancy word for how easy it is to dig and den and forage within the soil. So that's a level of compaction piece as well as soil type that's very important for the badger. Next slide, please. An update on where we're at. The recovery strategy, the federal one, which is an adoption of a BC recovery plan, that we're responsible for adding critical habitat and ensuring there's no socioeconomic pieces that may be in there, because under SARA, those are both required. The legislated timeline on American badger is clearly been blown out of the water. Overdue by, well, 17 years. Consultation and engagement around the species. I've definitely spoken with some groups about the species in the past, so it's ongoing. But right now we have a proposed federal recovery strategy that the intent is to post it to species at risk recovery at some time in the spring or summer of this year. And we're really keen to work with folks now or during that period or whenever works for you on the species. And in particular, since the schedule of studies definitely will identify working towards a better identification of critical habitat or a more fulsome one, that conversation should continue. And we have a lead biologist in region, Megan Harrison. You'll see her name up for a couple species. So if there's really technical questions, I can facilitate making sure that we have conversations between her yourself, and me, if we can figure it out. Next slide, please. The bank swallow. Another species that's threatened, so that means that it requires a federal recovery strategy and critical habitat is needed to be identified. The bank swallow is very small, or just not very small. It's not a hummingbird, but it's quite small, maybe 10 to 15 centimeters in size. They have brown upper parts, white under parts, a breast band that's very dark, and they, like most swallows, if you're familiar with swallows, which I'm guessing almost everybody is, they're a really sort of joyous animal to watch out there. And these guys flight around really kind of erratically, really fast turns, and they often are buzzy and chattery, which I like for descriptions. And the bank swallow can be found across British Columbia. It used to be thought that it had a much narrower scope of range, but the more we look, the more we find them. So that may be a good news story. There's actually a lot more than anybody knew, but we're trying to figure out more about that. Currently, it's at the status of threatened because of primarily, again, habitat loss and loss of insects, right? So the habitat they need is vertical banks. They create their nest sites by digging them out of the side of cliffs, really, in banks. So if you see an area where there's a lot of them, it's quite something when they're really active. I came across that once in BC, and it was pretty phenomenal. They like lake and ocean bluffs. They'll also find themselves in gravel quarries or road cuts and soil stockpiles, which are really clearly more challenging situations because those are linked to human activities. So open areas like grasslands and meadows and large wetlands are also really important for their foraging. And the threats to them, like I mentioned, are loss of nesting and hunting habitats. And the causes for that can be erosion or flood control, conversely, removal of gravel, habitat modification, and conversion of pastures to forests. And again, like I mentioned, and we're aware of that large-scale loss of the insects that this bird relies on. Next slide, please. So I've included these two maps around bank swallows range. I like the one on the right because it reminds us of how a species, that we find in BC, for example, or across Canada, isn't just here. It's linked to the far north as well as down into Central and South America. These little birds can go a good distance. So they're powerful, but they're still at risk. And if you look at the map on the left, you can see, in the time of year, breeding season for them in the north, they are up here. And we can see densities of breeding and migratory populations that are found across the province and the country. Next slide. So again, we have a partially identified set of critical habitat in a document that's being worked on by the Canadian Wildlife Service. It's based on confirmed nesting occurrences in natural settings that have been reported between 2001 and 2017, so pretty wide time frame. in the natural setting. So I think there was just a comment about a site where there's a lot of bank swallows. I didn't quite catch it, but I would love to see them, and it's nice to know where they are, and also really important with discussions around this. That kind of information is always welcome. The key, again, those biophysical attributes for their critical habitat is a vertical or near vertical face in something that they can dig into, can't be stone, and open to habitat for their foraging and hunting for insects primarily. Next slide, please. And a quick update on that recovery strategy. In December, we did send out some notifications. There's a jurisdictional review ongoing right now, which means before the document is actually going to be posted, we've shared a draft version with, well, we chose to share it with everybody in the province, given all the Indigenous groups in the province, rather, given that there's potential for overlap with both a lot of the province and potential industries that you may be linked to, other pieces like that. It is an overdue document since 2019 at the end of the year there, and the proposed recovery strategy, again, is being posted in or after the spring of 2021. Conversations are ongoing, and there's pushback right now around that timeline, specifically because of the need to consult and work with Indigenous communities across Canada. So we have a lead biologist on that again, named Kim Domes, and she's linked in with a lot of these conversations. And it's a document that's actually a national scope document and is being led by colleagues in the National Capital Region. But we have a lot of dialogue back and forth about what it means in BC and other regions, and so how we need to do this, best do this. So, next slide, please. Oh, the marbled murrelet. It's a threatened species, and this is a species that we're actually working on an amendment rather than the original document for the recovery strategy. You may remember that there was a recovery strategy for it published in 2014. It didn't have complete identification of critical habitat, and one of the pieces that there was a commitment to creating and figuring out the elements necessary was around marine critical habitat. So that's one of the first times that we're working on that at the Canadian Wildlife Service. That tends to be the realm of DFO, obviously. But that's ongoing, and I can say that it's not a very large area at this point that's been identified, and it exists sort of in the inside passage toward, rather, the Georgia Strait towards the northern end of it. The maps aren't finalized right now, and so I chose not to include them because it's up for discussion a bit. And if your community is interested, of course, we're really, really interested to speak. Ross Fennisland is working on this species right now as well, and he's also working on grizzly bear with me, and he's got a really good background in working on these files. So the habitat that we know that marbled murrelets rely on, they are a really neat bird that are pretty much one of the last birds that Western science ever figured out where they nest, because these little teeny dudes, 25 centimeter-ish birds, will fly up to 50 or more kilometers inland to get from the ocean where they forage for things like sand lance and herring, all the way to old growth forests where they make tiny little nests on big, broad, moss-covered branches way up in the tree, and they feed way out in these marine areas that are at the shore. So it took a long time to put two and two together, I suppose. And we now know that. So on the terrestrial side, there's a lot of protections. Working with the province is a really big thing around marbled murrelet, actually. There's a lot of efforts that have been being made for protections for their critical habitat. And now the marine critical habitat is the next piece of the puzzle that needs to be brought in. The threats to marbled murrelet, because they utilize the water, one of the big pushes around them being listed as threatened under the Species at Risk Act, and by COSOIC assessing them, the concern was around contamination from oil spills. With increasing tanker traffic and other pieces, it's recognized that one event could actually have a really drastic impact on the species, as well as that loss of the nesting habitat. They need old growth forest and marine feeding habitat, and sometimes they are actually impacted by bycatch within the fishing industry as well. So, next slide, please. See, there you know, that map is super helpful. They really do live on the shore, up and down the coast in BC, and then a little bit more further south and north. The majority of their habitat really is sort of from South Vancouver Island to up into Alaska. So next slide, please. For a moment, I'm going to pause and just loop into these questions that are coming in the chat so they don't build up and become overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have a few in
there.
Super,
same page. Yeah, I do see them, and I'm doing my best to multitask. There are a lot of bank swallows along the south bank of Notley River by the Kinney Dam flows are affecting the banks with erosion. So exactly, that's one of the big challenges. So that was Beverly that mentioned that. Thank you. And that's some of the pieces that this recovery strategy is working to address. So open up for discussion for sure, though. And it's something that it isn't a shock, unfortunately. And then Christine, you say that we have lots of bank swallow nesting sites in placer mine sites, I believe it's placer, and in gravel quarries. Are there other swallow species that nest in vertical till banks? I guess what I'm asking is if you see a nesting site in the vertical bank, can you assume that these are from bank swallows, or could it be from different swallows? I'm trying to recall. Barn swallows aren't really prone to doing that, and violet green, not so much. On the coast, we have the purple dudes, but they don't either. There's other birds that do, but I don't know that any other swallows, but I am definitely not the expert on the wide variety of swallows. In general, if you see a nesting site on a vertical bank, if it's a nesting site for swallows or any of the other migratory birds, it's important to recognize that they're not only potentially protected under the Species at Risk Act, but there's also the Migratory Bird Convention Act. And things like swallows are included under the protections provided by that. And that specifically means that those species are protected and their nest sites are protected. So that's something that's important to remember, especially when it's these migratory birds that are also species at risk, is that we actually start seeing in some cases an overlap of protections, which is nice to see, and that there are protections for the species that exist already. And so critical habitat is trying to strengthen that even further. So I'm happy to discuss that any further as well. The Migratory Birds Convention Act is an older piece of legislation. So the species that you see protected under it tend to be ones like ducks, because we want large populations of ducks because we hunt ducks. They're a food source. Or species, for example, like, the swallows, because even then I think that it was recognized that they would eat up bugs, and bugs are annoying. So back to the marbled murrelet. That's a bird that is not protected under the Migratory Birds Convention Act, to be clear. The recovery strategy for that, like I mentioned before, is an amendment to include that marine critical habitat. So it's important to recognize that we're not in a spot where we're opening up the whole document, but the discussion is really about this marine piece and where there are biophysical attributes that can be found and protected, hopefully, for the species. If I recall correctly, it's about the habitat for their prey species being protected, more so than any specific area that they utilize necessarily, because they utilize where their prey is. So the consultation engagement for this amendment is ongoing, and I'm happy to hear from anybody that's keen to talk about it some more. The proposed amendment We're thinking that it could go up to the Species at Risk Public Registry for a 60-day comment period, perhaps in or after spring, summer of this year. And the lead biologists are Ross Venisland and Carrie Wu. Carrie's been working on that species for a number of years. So, next slide, please. Oh, Oregon forest snail. My favorite small snail. I like snails a lot generally. This one is endangered, and it's a pretty big snail that we find primarily in BC. We find it in the Fraser Valley. They're about 3.5 centimeters across. They're pale brown, and the key thing I use for identifying them is that they have sort of a really white flared rim at the where they come out of. And they're found, like I said, in the lower areas of the Fraser Valley and southeastern Vancouver Island as well. They like to live in older mixedwood forests, deciduous areas. They really love big leaf maple, black cottonwood, and thick vegetation. So newer growth is actually great for them. They love stinging nettle. You know, if you're willing to get stung, they're not, in some areas you can find them pretty well in the midst of a stinging nettle patch. So the threats for them, like so many species at risk, are habitat fragmentation, loss or damage, brush burning, trampling, or pesticides. They're really sensitive to pesticides as a mollusk. And herbicides, of course, are going to damage their food sources. As well, there's a bunch of introduced species that compete for food and shelter in those ecosystems. Even within the snail and mollusk realm, there's quite a few introduced species that compete with our local endemic species. So, next slide, please. So one thing that I think is really important to mention is that the key part of the amendment to the Oregon Forest Snail Recovery Strategy that is sort of just starting up right now is to do a far better job of identifying critical habitat in the Fraser Valley and potential critical habitat in areas. Oregon forest snails meet because it doesn't take long for habitat for it to be created. It, for example, thrives on right-of-ways in a lot of situations because right-of-ways are continuously cleared, but they have fast regrowth of different things like nettles that they like. That map is from the older recovery strategy, and it's not the best, I suppose, is a nice diplomatic way of saying it. It's I don't have a map I can show right now because modeling is not finished and we haven't had opportunity to work with many people on it. So there's a lot of refinement that needs to happen, but that's a map just for information's sake. Next slide, please. So the update on the status of the document right now is that we don't have a legislated timeline. Amendments don't come with those timelines, but are often required when documents are being created because in the schedule of studies, we recognize there's more work that needs to be done to improve the document. And we can amend any document that is deemed necessary. This one was published in 2016, and we're now in a place of consulting or engaging at the early end on amending it. The proposed timeline is potentially fall or winter of this year into next year. The document isn't too far along in development around that critical habitat piece. And my colleagues Eric Gross and Megan Harrison are leading on that. Next slide, please. Yes, Western Screech Owl. So the Western Screech Owl, there's two subspecies, and so you'll see a repeat almost of slides. They're very similar. The big differentiation is where they exist within BC. The Kinnicottie is found on the coast of British Columbia and the island, so it is the west loving of the two subspecies and lives in low elevation forests. They're mostly gray-brown. They have sort of a front that's a bit lighter, white breast, and some dark streaks all over them, quite pretty. And they often like mixed deciduous forests, tree cavities. And they often move into tree cavities that have been made by other species, like different woodpecker species. They are under threat, again, habitat loss and damage, urban development, as well as agricultural and forestry practices. Insecticides have a horrible impact on these guys, or excuse me, rodenticides and such, different pesticides, because they hunt for those species and they can become ill from that. Barred owls are also another species that's been expanding its range into Canada, and they compete pretty directly with western screech owls for prey and sometimes for habitat. So, next slide, please. So here we have the McFarlanei. I think I always pronounce that wrong, but that's the subspecies that you're going to find instead of on the coast. You find these guys in central and eastern BC. I had the pleasure of meeting one actually when I was at the Inalkin Center in Penticton, just a few steps really outside of the center. There was one on a cold winter day, chilling out in some nice rays of sun, and they do seem to have a little bit more of the black or the darker sort of streaks on them than the coastal one, at least from what I've witnessed. And they, again, lower elevation forested areas. They like to be near water. They use tree cavities, and they have the same sorts of risks or threats to their survival as the western screech owls we find on the coast. Vehicles are known to be another cause of harm to these guys. So, and both of them are listed as threatened. Next slide, please. Yeah, so you can see this map isn't actually split into the different subspecies because they're often discussed in groups because they're so similar. And you can see the two sort of arms of that larger population unit that goes all the way down south, where we have them on the coast all the way up on the island, and then in a little patch that sort of hangs out in central and eastern BC. Next slide, please. So the western screech owl update is that there is a recovery document that we're embarking on developing. It's going to be for both species in one document. There's a BC recovery plan that the intent is to adopt with addition of critical habitat because they don't include that. The legislated timeline is overdue again, February of 2019. Consultation and engagement is ongoing. And the proposed recovery strategy is expected to be posted, maybe we're aiming for fall winter of 2021. Megan Harrison and Greg Rickbeal are the leads, and I see a question. Just let me open up the chat. It popped away. How is the spotted owl recovery plan coinciding with the culling of western screech owl? Well, I cannot speak to the culling of western screech owl. I can speak to the spotted owl recovery plan, and it's actually just, we're at a point of reaching out and doing consultation on that document right now. It's really localized and highly political, and so we're steering clear of it at this workshop, but it's definitely one that there's a lot of energy and attention being paid to it every day right now in the Canadian Wildlife Service, and I'm sure and aware of within many bands as well. So I don't know how it coincides with the culling of western screech owl because I'm not familiar with western screech owl culling. Does anybody have more information they can share with me about that, to be entirely curious and honest? Perhaps we can put that in the to be discussed further, Denise, because definitely I'm not in the know enough to respond. I don't know if there's anybody else on the federal team that's in the loop a bit more. Okay, well, silence indicates perhaps that that's something that we can follow up on. I hope that's helpful. Could we jump to the next slide, please? So if you were here earlier today, you heard me speak to language and its importance in the way that people understand their environments and species and how they live with them. And we recognize that people in all cultures do use language to describe the kinds of things and organize the patterns or of repetition they find in the world around them. And that different languages and knowledge systems can provide complementary descriptions to biodiversity, and that Indigenous knowledge embodies detailed information about the environment that's really been largely overlooked. And when I was speaking to the grizzly bear file, I was mentioning it was a very high priority for that file to incorporate traditional knowledge. And it's a priority, honestly, for all of the species we're working on to the extent that we can and that groups are comfortable. I'm keen to work on how we may include traditional knowledge in the most respectful and appropriate way, respecting the needs of communities, the intellectual property rights, utilizing the OCAP principles, and making sure that incorporation of Indigenous knowledge and knowledge systems isn't taken for granted, nor trying to put everything, to shoehorn it into a Western science scenario, for example, isn't doing justice to either, I don't think. So scenario where there's growth needed within the way that the Environment and Climate Change Canadian Wildlife Service does things, and there's definitely movement to do it. A piece that we have managed to start working on is around this language revitalization project, where we've been able to be collecting and gathering different words from Indigenous languages from the public realm, so from libraries or internet websites, pieces that we can access to gather different words for these species at risk. There were a lot for grizzly bear, but we've actually started gathering them to discuss, maybe spur some communication or discussion on these species as well. It's something that we're keen to be able to include if there's interest and support for that, that we're keen to hear from people about what's right, what's wrong. We're pretty sure there's going to be things that are wrong, and we're happy to hear where we're wrong as well. That's how we keep learning, and I'm really keen to hear from people. So if there's anything about these species that you're keen to share. If we move to the next slide, we actually have brought together, I think the next slide is the beginning of the different language table. Oh, it's a slide, again, with the different language families in BC. We have a lovely linguist who is helping us with this and contracted because she's much more capable and familiar with the details and fine work around linguistics and the fine details and differences between some languages as well. Look at how many language families we have in BC. The map is quite blurry, but languages don't have hard and fast lines, much like ecosystems or cultural groups. It's hard to just say, here's the boundary. And so we're trying to include this, and the database is being worked on. We've heard from folks that they'd like to hear more about pronunciation, and I agree. So that's something that I think that we can be starting to work towards, hopefully. And if we move to the next slide, is that where I started? Or do I have the biocultural approach? Yeah, the biocultural diversity slide. I really like this slide because it's something that we're also working towards incorporation in how we listen and learn around Indigenous knowledge, and sort of recognizing that those social ecological systems are dynamic and they're about cultures and biology and the environment and long-term relationships. Biocultural diversity is something that we can try and embrace, shows the highlights and the interactions between human diversity and the diversity of biological systems. That map we just saw shows so many language groups in BC and so many Indigenous groups that are linked to those language groups, and so much diversity And we also have so much biodiversity, and there has to be a link there that I think it's really important. The photo I've included is of camas. I'm from Victoria, and it's a species that was and is very significant and important for a food source where there's long-term relationships with the sites that they exist on and relationships between different communities as to knowing whose family goes here every spring to harvest. And it's a species that there's a lot of ecosystem restoration working on, and there's some positive stories, but Garry Oak ecosystems where they exist are another at-risk ecosystem more broadly, and really important, right? Okay, I really think the next slides are the start of the tables. Am I right? Yes. So I'm not going to go through all of these, and these are just sort of where we're at right now. And we're open for discussion, feedback, everything like I've mentioned. We've found that there are some easily accessed words around badger that are in this region, as well as a bit further afield. Next slide. This is the one that I was honestly a bit shocked by and super excited to see, was how many different words in indigenous languages, excuse me, there are for swallow, in its varied ways. And there's another page of these different words. And this is what's been gathered mostly by Kate over the last not too long in her research. So if can we jump to the next slide as well? So see that there's no shortage, even just within the BC realm. And this is a species, as I mentioned, that's national in scope. And we were talking about this with colleagues that are in other regions and saying, this is something that we're really impressed and could be included as an annex if we're gathering this information and can check it if there's support from communities and it seems like the right choice. And they're thinking, well, maybe that's something when we talk to communities, and so it's starting to spread in a really good organic way from the ground up. And we want this to be something that can be really collaborative. We don't want to come with empty hands, and maybe working on these words around these species can help us venture into more conversations more broadly about the species and what it means for you or your community more broadly, and how we can best manage the species together. I think we have a few more tables that I'd just like to highlight, and then I think we're going to just open up for conversation and discussion. Any pieces that folks want to share or chat about? Can we get the next slide, Cheyenne? Or no, Kate now? Sorry. On the other hand, marbled murrelet, the one Salish word, going to be Coast Salish because of where that guy lives. But look at that. Big bird, large bird of any kind, any waterfowl. So marbled murrelet falls into that, but that's not as specific necessarily. And perhaps there are more words about it, but we don't know. And so we're keen to learn. I think that there are quite a few words not for the snail. There's some for snail, and then quite a few words again for owl. I also really wanted to mention briefly that we recognize that owl can be a bit of a sensitive species to speak around, and we really wanted to be sensitive, and if folks don't want to speak to it or are concerned, we respect that, but it is a species at risk, and we want to do the best we can for every species at risk that's out there. So I think we can maybe jump through the language slides, and I think I just have a, wow, look how many there are for snail. Again, I mean, snails are found in low elevation areas that are like, and these guys are found near the Fraser River. So there's going to be a lot of overlap with communities and with people that really have an intimate knowledge of the land. And these guys are pretty big, so you get to know them. And then owl, I think there's a couple pages, and it's more broad again, not always screech owl. Thank you, Christine, for sharing the Tlingit word. I don't I know how to pronounce that. And again, I really do. The pronunciation is really essential, right? We can see words on paper, but unless we have a bit of confidence to say it, it can be hard when we're trying to revitalize a language. Or even if we want the confidence, my name's Undiné, and people see it on paper and go, So when I write it out phonetically for folks, it seems to help out sometimes. Same goes here. We like to have the confidence to say things, but it takes a lot to work to that, doesn't it? I think there's one more for owls, I think. Yep, look at all of them. And we're still working on this. And then that's the last species, right? Woo, questions. And that's my contact information, as well as the information for the generic inbox that we have for the species at risk work that we do, which we often send notifications and pieces from. So if you don't get emails from that and you think you should, let me know. You could email me, and then I'll definitely have your contact info. We have it through this workshop, so we're good. But those are good addresses to add to your not spam list. And if you want to text me, that's the best way. I like texts. So thank you very much, everybody. And I see copying and pasting. That's brilliant. Thank you. And I really want to open the floor up for folks' comments or questions or concerns or whatever people feel called to say, or you're welcome to add comments in the chat box or get in touch.